the whole spying genre, there's something inherently queer about that, I always think. And not just on the screen as well. I mean, on the screen, you've got even people like Jason Bourne, who, it's kind of like a harder adventure than Bond. It doesn't have the campy aspects and that kind of thing. But his first adventure is called The Bourne Identity. It's about a search for identity. A lot of spy stories, the MacGuffin, to use Hitchcock's term, is a stolen nuclear bomb or microfilm or something like that. But spy stories are inherently stories about a search for identity, because often spies are having a crisis of identity. It's very existential. What am I doing this job for? Why am I doing all these horrible things? I spend day in, day out disguised, using aliases when I can't really be myself. Off screen as well. Spying is not just queer on screen, it's queer off screen as well. So probably the most famous example in British history of spying and queerness, in the middle of the 20th century, there were a group of friends at Cambridge University that became known subsequently as the Cambridge Spies. And in fact, there was a TV adaptation with some Bond alumni, including Toby Stephens, not too long ago. So the Cambridge Spies were a group of friends at Cambridge University. Not all of them were queer, but a couple of them were. And the whole scandal of these friends who then turned, essentially. Is there a more queer term than turned? So they turned, and some of them went to actually live in the USSR because they'd been spying against Britain. And because a couple of them were gay, they made that connection in the minds of a lot of the British public that spying was a very queer thing to do. Even in fiction, you've got Somerset Maugham, who wrote short stories about a character called Ashenden, and a lot of people see that as a prototype for James Bond. And Somerset himself, although I don't believe he came out in his lifetime, he was at least queer, if not a gay man as well. So spying has always been inextricably linked with queerness. I don't think it's just the James Bond character that appeals to queer people about James Bond. It's a lot about his world as well, particularly the villains. I remember when I first saw Diamonds Are Forever, and it always felt a little bit more subversive in a way, or at least salacious, than some of the other films up to that point. And remember, I watched James Bond films out of order as well, so a lot of Roger Moore was played on mainstream TV, so I didn't see some of the darker ones. But when I saw Diamonds Are Forever for the first time, I was immediately drawn to Mr. Wint and Mr. Kidd, the gay hitmen. And even though they were hitmen, I still kind of saw myself in them in a way. Please don't take this the wrong way. But it was the first time I think that I'd ever seen two men in love on screen, and it blew my mind. I was just like, that's actually possible. And it stayed with me for years and years and years. And although there are not many out gay, lesbian characters, queer characters in general, the villains always held my attention, perhaps even more than James Bond himself. I think perhaps even though I'm dressed in a tuxedo right now and whatever, there are so many similarities between Bond and the villains. I think it's really the villains that I could identify with more than Bond. James Bond obviously appeals to people around the world, but being British, I think we probably have not an affinity with the character necessarily, but I don't think we've really got a choice, to be honest. A lot of us are just brought up on Bond. they were always on during bank holidays. They were always on over Christmas. I used to clock up lots of James Bond films over Christmas. I always used to hope there was at least one that I hadn't seen. You know, this was back in the day before we had streaming films, and you know, we didn't even have much in the way of VHS in our house. Which makes it sound really poor, but no, it was, you know, I wasn't deprived. My parents just weren't huge movie fans, and we had lots of blank tapes. So I used to tape the Bond films off TV, and they always used to have adverts in. And you know what? Even now, I watch the films, and it gets to a certain point, and I'm going, "Oh, there's going to be an ad break in a minute," and then I'm kind of disappointed when there isn't one. But yeah. Being British, we are born and raised on Bond, a lot of us. Not everyone likes James Bond, obviously, but most people in the UK have that cultural reference point. So if ever I'm with a group of people and they start talking about football or something like that, and sorry to be a gay stereotype, but football, you know, I don't stand a chance, and I don't even try. But I do try and steer the conversation to something that I can contribute to. And Bond tends to be that common denominator across groups of people. You know, which is your favourite James Bond? The question I never answer. Because, you know, I love that mutability of identity between the films. You know, what is your favourite James Bond film? I tend to answer Casino Royale, but then trying to pick a second is quite tough. But, you know, actually people tend not to bring up James Bond when I'm around, because about half an hour later I'm still going on and on about it. Bond films usually end with Bond in the arms of a woman, but it's never terribly convincing that that's going to last. It only does last in one film, you know, the last one, Spectre, and from the trailer it appears like that's going to be fairly short-lived. Who knows how it will finally end? But I think that also appeals to gay men like myself, because we know that Bond is not going to be happy because he just finds a girl and finds temporary or longer term gratification, to put it mildly. But that I think is something that certainly appeals to gay men. Conversely, you could say that, you know, we all want James Bond to be happy, don't we? Maybe after 20 odd films he's just looking in the wrong place. Maybe No Time to Die will end up with him in the arms of another man. No, I can't see it either. But we can dream. So Bond is your ultimate man's man, the red-blooded, heterosexual. I've never really seen it that way. Bond actually has, for me anyway, many of the stereotypical characteristics of a gay man. And I really do mean stereotypical. You know, not all gay men are as obsessed with James Bond as wearing the right clothes, knowing the right perfumes, drinking the right drinks, and, you know, asking for the perfect amounts of everything, and preparing things in exactly the right way. The food, the gourmet cigarettes, you know, these are the accoutrement of someone who, they're very materialistic possessions. But if you go below the surface, James Bond is also a very stereotypical gay man. And sad as it is, but it's a fact, you know, gay men suffer, and like a lot of queer people suffer, gay men suffer with mental health problems generally across a population more than non-queer people. And sometimes gay men, even if they don't have significant mental health problems, are associated with excessive consumption of drugs and drink, all of which James Bond does, particularly drugs in the books. uppers, downers, whatever, to get him through the day, get him through the mission. He has the most epic hangovers, like at the start of the novel of Thunderball. That whole first 2 pages is just a description of his self-recrimination for drinking 11 alcoholic drinks the night before. So in that way, James Bond is also a stereotypical gay man. I think perhaps the most profound way that James Bond is a stereotypical gay man, and of course this again isn't exclusive to gay men, but he's very lonely. Purely from, a plot point of view, it's not a good idea to marry your hero off too soon, but as soon as Bond gets close to any woman, it usually doesn't turn out very well, particularly for the woman. It has to be said. They tend to get they're even worse off than Bond. But he's always alone, and when the filmmakers try to make Bond less alone, he's somehow more convincing. I know a lot of gay men, including my husband, who often don't feel like they can identify with the central characters in stories, particularly if they're like alpha male characters, and so sometimes people identify with the female characters. And as I say, I've never really felt this particularly strongly myself, but I know a lot of gay men love the Bond girls. The one who stands out to me is Xenia Onatopp in GoldenEye, not least of all because I spent hundreds, if not thousands of hours playing as that character in the video game GoldenEye 007 on the Nintendo 64 in the late 90s. And she's, some people have described her as a drag queen, and I can kind of see where they're coming from there, but she's got this queer quality which many of technically she's not a girl, she's a villain, but many of the girls have that kind of drag queen quality. They are performing femininity in the same way that James Bond is performing masculinity. It's like all of the films are almost like this. They are this performance. They're unwilling almost to kind of go below that surface and probe anything that's not, glossily heteronormative. And yet, I think that the more recent films, the more gritty films, and you could even count things like License to Kill from 1989, actually have greater queer appeal, because they actually delve into the psychology of Bond himself, and they're often identity quests. Like Casino Royale is my favourite Bond film, and I finally worked out, it's obviously a brilliant exercise in filmmaking, but I finally worked out why I love that film so much, and it's because it's a coming out story. It's James Bond becoming James Bond. He's undergone a career transition from the military, and now he's in military intelligence. So there's not a world of difference, but he's having to find new ways to behave and act. He earns the tuxedo, the Aston Martin, and he acquires all of that. But in the end, it's not really him. And by the end, even by the end, when he's triumphantly holding that gun in the air, there's still a feeling of, it is a triumph, but he's still got some psychological work to do. Bond is also like a gay man in that he's afraid to let people in a lot of the time. And for films that have kind of a sexy reputation, there's actually, and obviously this is for the family audience, the books kind of amp it up a bit more, but considerably more actually, depending on which book you read. But the sex is always treated like a joke. The amount of innuendos in James Bond. I was always really drawn to the Roger Moore films as a child, and I still have that kind of snarky kind of double entendre sense of humour, which I blame entirely on Roger Moore. It's not me, it's Roger Moore, honestly. But it's that unwillingness to talk about real things. James Bond will only kind of skim the surface in a conversation unless it's about alcohol or food or cars or something like that. There's something really, really performative about James Bond's masculinity. And I think that's probably helped by the fact that 6 men to date, in the official series anyway, have played the character. And each time they play the character slightly, or sometimes more than slightly, differently. You know, imagine going from Roger Moore in View to a Kill to 2 years later Timothy Dalton in The Living Daylights. There's a big difference between those performances. And I think that probably appealed to me because I saw that James Bond could change. He was constantly undergoing something of an identity crisis. I know that James Bond changing actor drives some people to distraction, you know, with that modern obsession like in the Marvel universe of continuity and the characters all have to be the same, played by the same actors, that idea. But I've never had an issue with that, and I think it is because I've always seen James Bond as performing in a way. Probably the most performative thing about James Bond's masculinity is his signature drink, the martini. So the martini is a cocktail that you make from a small amount of vermouth in most people's recipes, certainly my recipe, and quite a large amount of gin, and then you garnish it with lemon or olives, or, you know, if you're feeling fancy, an onion, if you know you want to make a Gibson. There are so many different kinds of martini, so many different ways of modifying that basic recipe, and James Bond is famously fussy, having the right kind of vermouth, the quinine lillet and that kind of thing. But James Bond really makes the martini his own by famously shaking it. Now, actually, most people would say the last thing you want to do with a martini is you shake it. You, for a start, make it look all cloudy rather than a beautifully clear drink. But also, James Bond is making his drink weaker, if anything. Because if you shake a martini, then all the ice chips off and it just dilutes the drink. So the only reason James Bond asks for a shaken martini rather than a stirred martini is because, what, he's afraid someone's going to say, what, that's a gay drink you've just ordered. So the shaking is just there to make it seem more masculine, to brutalise that alcohol. Fleming uses the word bruising the alcohol. So it's almost like he's having a fight with his drink before he's able to drink it. Yeah, it doesn't bode well for Bond's masculinity, does it? That you have to beat up a drink before you even take your first sip. You can find my queer reviews, that's what I call them, going back through these films that I've grown up with and watched too many times, but with a queer set of lenses on. You can find those at licensedqueer.com. I'm also on Twitter and Instagram, the same name, but it's spelled in the UK way, license with 2 C's, there's no S in there. So I look forward to hearing from you.